Number 15. The nest above. Before any member of the genus Homo stacked a single stone or bent a single branch into a frame, another primate had already been engineering sleeping platforms in the canopy. Great apes, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, and bonobos build nests every single night. These are not casual accumulations of leaves. They are weight-bearing structures assembled, using techniques that vary by species, by individual preference, and by the mechanical properties of the available branches. In 2012, primatologist Roland Enos and structural engineer Adam van Kasteren at the University of Manchester published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences analyzing the engineering properties of orangutan nests in Sumatra. What they found was that orangutans actively tested the flexibility of branches before selecting them, bending each one to evaluate its load-bearing capacity. Thicker, more rigid branches were used as the structural framework. Thinner, more pliable branches were woven into a supportive mattress above. The distinction between structural support and comfort layer was deliberate. Orangutans do not simply pile vegetation. They assess, select, and arrange materials based on their mechanical properties. In functional terms, they are making engineering decisions. Enos described the construction as an example of complex manipulative behavior that requires planning, material assessment, and an understanding of structural forces. The connection to human architecture is not a metaphor, it is a direct evolutionary inheritance. The common ancestor of humans and great apes, living roughly 7 to 10 million years ago, almost certainly nested in trees. When that ancestor descended to the ground, the cognitive toolkit for building a shelter, testing materials, assessing structural loads, creating a defined sleeping space, came with it. Every house you have ever lived in is an elaboration of a behavior that began in the forest canopy, millions of years before anything resembling a human being existed. The question is when that nesting instinct first manifested on the ground. The next entry presents the oldest and most controversial answer. Number 14. The circle in the gorge. In 1962, Mary Leakey excavated a site designated DK in the lower levels of Olduvai Gorge, Tanzania. What she uncovered, beneath a layer of volcanic tuff dated to approximately 1.85 million years ago, was a roughly circular arrangement of loosely stacked lava blocks. The circle was about 4 meters in diameter. Inside it were stone tools and fragmented animal bones. Just outside the circle, more debris. At the center, what appeared to be a concentration of activity. Leakey interpreted the formation as the remains of a simple windbreak or shelter, constructed by Homo habilis, the earliest known toolmaker. If she was right, this was the oldest artificial structure in the archaeological record. Not by centuries, by over 1 million years. The interpretation was immediately contested. Some researchers argued that the stone arrangement could have been produced naturally, by the roots of a large tree growing through volcanic sediment, pushing rocks outward into a circular pattern as the root system expanded. Others pointed out that the site sat on the shore of an ancient lake, and that water action could have redistributed the stones into an arrangement that only resembled intentional construction. In the decades since, no consensus has formed. Charles Egeland of the University of North Carolina at Greensboro led new excavations at DK East between 2012 and 2014, recovering additional fossils and lithic artifacts from below the tuff layer. The abundance of material confirms that hominins were active at the site. Whether they were building there remains unresolved. The DK circle sits in a category that archaeologists find deeply uncomfortable. It is not clearly natural, it is not clearly artificial. It occupies the boundary between coincidence and intention, and that boundary is where some of the most important questions in human evolution remain unanswered. If Leakey was correct, then a species with a brain roughly half the size of a modern human's was constructing defined spaces nearly 2 million years ago. If she was wrong, then the earliest evidence of shelter building shifts forward by more than 1 million years. The stakes of that single interpretation are enormous. Yet, even if the DK circle was built by hominin hands, it does not tell us whether those hands understood what they were doing. The next entry examines a place where the evidence for intentional occupation is older, deeper, and far less ambiguous. Number 13. The deepest fire. Wonderwork Cave sits in the northern Cape Province of South Africa, carved into a dolomite hillside in the Kuruman Hills. The cave extends more than 140 meters into the rock. It is one of the longest continuously occupied sites in the archaeological record. Evidence of hominin activity inside it stretches back more than 1,000,000 years. In 2012, a team led by Francesco Berna of Boston University and Paul Goldberg published findings in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, confirming that traces of fire, including burned bone fragments and ashed plant material, had been found in sediment layers dated to approximately 1,000,000 years ago. The evidence was located about 30 meters inside the cave entrance. This was not a wildfire that swept through an open landscape. This was fire used deep inside an enclosed space. The significance is not just the age, it is the location. A fire burning 30 meters inside a cave requires transport. Someone or something carried burning material or ignition sources into a dark, enclosed space and maintained combustion there. Whether this constitutes controlled use of fire remains debated. The team could not confirm that the fire was deliberately ignited. However, they could confirm that it was burning in a location where natural ignition was essentially impossible. Lightning does not strike 30 meters inside a dolomite cave. Wonderwork Cave does not contain structural remains. There are no walls, no post holes, no stacked stones. But what it demonstrates is something arguably more important. By 1,000,000 years ago, a hominin species, probably Homo erectus, was modifying the interior of an enclosed natural space by introducing fire. The cave was not merely occupied. It was managed. A managed cave is not a house, but it is the cognitive precursor to one. The decision to modify the conditions inside a shelter, to bring fire into darkness, to alter the thermal environment of a space you intend to return to, is a decision that sits closer to architecture than to animal behavior. It suggests that the concept of interior space, a space with conditions different from the outside world, had already formed in a brain 1/3 the size of yours. However, modifying a cave is not the same as building from nothing. The next entry presents evidence that an entirely different hominin species was doing exactly that, in total darkness, 176,000 years ago. Number 12. The Ring in the Dark. Bruniquel Cave is located in southwestern France, overlooking the Aveyron Valley. The cave had been sealed naturally during the Pleistocene by rockfall and sediment accumulation, and its interior remained untouched for tens of thousands of years until cavers dug through the collapsed entrance in 1990. What they found 336 meters from the entrance, deep in absolute darkness, defied every assumption about the cognitive abilities of the species that built it. On the cave floor sat two roughly circular structures composed of broken stalagmites. More than 400 individual stalagmite pieces had been deliberately snapped from the cave floor, transported and arranged into overlapping rings. The larger ring measured 6.7 meters across. A smaller ring, 2.2 meters in diameter, sat nearby. Several additional piles of stalagmite fragments surrounded them. On top of some of the arranged pieces, researchers found blackened and reddened areas consistent with the controlled use of fire. Fragments of burned bone, including what appeared to be bare bone, were recovered near the smaller ring. In 2016, Jacques Joubert of the University of Bordeaux and a large team of collaborators published their analysis in the journal Nature. Using uranium series dating on the stalagmites and the calcite that had grown over the structures in the millennia since their construction, they established an age of approximately 176,500 years. The margin of error was plus or minus 100 years. That date placed the construction firmly within the period of early Neanderthals. Homo sapiens would not arrive in Europe for another 130,000 years. Whatever built these structures was not us. Jaubert's team described the geometry of the rings as regular and deliberate. The stalagmite fragments were of similar sizes. The arrangement was not random accumulation. It was planned construction. The fires were lit on top of the structures, not on the cave floor beside them, a detail that remains unexplained. The researchers wrote that the regular geometry, the arrangement of broken stalagmites, and several traces of fire demonstrate the anthropogenic origin of these constructions. In 2026, Kim Genuit and colleagues published additional geological evidence establishing a timeline for when the cave entrance opened and closed. Their work confirmed that the cave became sealed by rockfall sometime before approximately 143,000 years ago, corroborating the earlier dating and ruling out the possibility that later humans had entered and built the structures. The purpose of the rings remains unknown. They are too deep inside the cave for practical habitation. They show no signs of long-term occupation. The most common interpretation is ritual or symbolic use, but that interpretation raises its own unsettling questions. If Neanderthals were conducting planned activities 336 meters inside a pitch-dark cave, transporting materials, managing fire, and constructing geometric arrangements, then the cognitive gap between them and early Homo sapiens may have been far narrower than the archaeological record previously suggested. The Bruniqual structures are not homes, but they are the oldest known evidence of a non-human hominin deliberately constructing something from raw materials in a defined space. The line between ritual construction and domestic construction may be thinner than anyone assumed. The next entry presents what was, for decades, considered the oldest deliberate dwelling ever found, and the debate over whether it actually was a dwelling has never been resolved. Number 11. The Beloved Land. In 1966, construction workers digging the foundation for a luxury apartment building on the slopes of Mount Boron in Nice, France, uncovered ancient remains in the hillside. One of the workers alerted authorities. Within days, prehistorian Henry de Lumley of the Sorbonne had negotiated access to the site. He was given from January 28 to July 5 of that year to excavate before the apartment construction resumed. He and his team worked 7 days a week. By the end, they were working around the clock. What de Lumley uncovered at the site he named Terra Amata, Italian for beloved land, were the remains of what he interpreted as 21 separate living floors, each containing the traces of oval-shaped huts. The largest measured roughly 15 meters long and 6 meters wide. De Lumley described a pattern of post holes where saplings had been driven into the sandy ground, supported at their bases by rings of beach stones, and presumably bent inward at the top to form a roof frame. Animal hides or vegetation would have been draped over the structure for cover. Inside each hut, a central hearth sat surrounded by ash. Low walls of stacked stones and beach pebbles had been arranged on the northwest side of several fireplaces, positioned to block the Mistral wind. The site dated to approximately 400,000 years ago, during the warm interglacial period known as marine isotope stage 11. The builders were almost certainly Homo heidelbergensis, a species ancestral to both Neanderthals and modern humans. De Lumley believed that small groups of hunter-gatherers had returned seasonally to the beach at Terra Amata, setting up temporary shelters each time. He described communities of 20 to 40 individuals occupying the huts while they hunted elephants, deer, wild boar, and rabbits along the prehistoric coastline. If his interpretation was correct, Terra Amata represented the oldest deliberate human-built dwellings in Europe. The Guinness Book of World Records listed the site as the first known habitational structure. However, the interpretation did not go unchallenged. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, archaeologist Paula Villa of the University of Colorado conducted a detailed reanalysis of the site. Villa argued that many of the features de Lumley had interpreted as separate living floors were more likely the result of geological processes. Sediment compression, natural water action, and the mixing of cultural materials across layers could have created patterns that resembled intentional construction without any human builder being involved. The stone arrangements, she argued, might have been natural features of the ancient beach rather than architectural elements. The debate has never been fully resolved. Some researchers accept de Lumley's interpretation with qualifications. Others consider the evidence insufficient to confirm deliberate construction. The site itself now lies beneath the apartment building whose construction originally revealed it, making re-examination impossible. Terra Amata sits in the same uncomfortable space as the DK Circle at Olduvai. It is either one of the most important architectural discoveries in human history or one of the most famous misinterpretations in archaeology. The answer depends on which researcher you ask. But while scientists argue over ambiguous European sites, a discovery on the opposite side of the world claims an even more extraordinary age. Number 10. The Hilltop Claim. In the year 2000, Japanese archaeologists announced that they had uncovered the remains of what they believed to be the oldest artificial structure in the world, on a hillside at Chichibu, north of Tokyo. The shelter, they argued, had been built by Homo erectus. The dating, if confirmed, would have placed the structure at approximately 500,000 years old, making it older than Terra Amata by a significant margin. The claim generated immediate international attention. The idea that Homo erectus in East Asia had been building shelters 500,000 years ago pushed the timeline for deliberate construction deep into the lower Paleolithic, a period when most researchers assumed hominins lived in the open or sought refuge in natural caves and rock overhangs. However, the announcement landed in the middle of a crisis in Japanese archaeology. In November 2000, journalist Mainichi Shimbun filmed amateur archaeologist Shinichi Fujimura secretly burying artifacts at a site before discovering them during a planned excavation. The scandal, which became known as the Coat Hands Affair, revealed that Fujimura had been fabricating finds across multiple sites for decades. The Japanese Archaeological Association subsequently re-examined dozens of claims from the Lower and Middle Paleolithic in Japan. Many were downgraded or retracted. The Chichibu shelter claim was not directly linked to Fujimura, but the broader loss of confidence in Japanese Lower Paleolithic research cast a long shadow. International researchers treated the claim with heightened skepticism, and subsequent independent verification has not confirmed the original interpretation. The episode illustrates a pattern that appears throughout the history of shelter archaeology. The desire to push the timeline of human construction deeper into the past is powerful, and that desire creates conditions in which ambiguous evidence can be overinterpreted, and, in the worst cases, fabricated. Every claim about the oldest dwelling in the world carries an implicit prestige that can distort the very science meant to evaluate it. The next entry presents a discovery where the evidence is not ambiguous. The structures are unmistakable, and they were built from the bones of animals that no longer exist. Number 9. The Bone Fortress. In 1965, a Ukrainian farmer near the village of Mezirich, approximately 110 kilometers southeast of Kyiv, was digging to expand his cellar when his shovel struck something massive and curved. It was the lower jawbone of a woolly mammoth. He kept digging. More bones emerged. Then more. What had started as a basement renovation became one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. Professional excavations between 1966 and 1974 revealed 4 separate dome-shaped structures built almost entirely from mammoth bones. A total of 149 individual mammoth bones had been arranged in rough circles, 6 to 10 meters in diameter, with tusks, skulls, long bones, and jawbones interlocked to form walls. Central hearths sat inside each structure. Stone tools and other debris surrounded and filled them. The structures had been covered with animal hides, creating insulated shelters capable of withstanding the brutal winters of the Eastern European steppe. For decades, the dating of the Mezhiric structures remained broad, ranging from roughly 19,000 to 12,000 years ago. In 2025, archaeologist Wei Chu of Universität Leiden and colleagues published a study in Open Research Europe that dramatically refined the chronology. By radiocarbon dating small mammal remains found directly within the cultural layers, rather than the mammoth bones themselves, which can produce misleading dates due to the old carbon reservoir effect, the team established that the largest structure, designated MBS-4, dated to approximately 18,248 to 17,764 years ago. That places it just after the last glacial maximum, the coldest phase of the most recent ice age. The truly remarkable finding was the duration. The radiocarbon data indicated that MBS-4 had been in use for up to 429 years, nearly half a millennium. This was not a temporary camp erected for a single winter and abandoned. It was a multi-generational dwelling, maintained, repaired, and reoccupied across centuries. The researchers described the mammoth bone dwellings as practical solutions for survival, demonstrating that Ice Age communities were highly adaptive to environments where timber was scarce and temperatures dropped far below freezing for months at a time. The mammoth bone huts of Mezhiric represent something profoundly different from the ambiguous stone circles and contested post holes of earlier sites. They are unmistakably artificial. They required planning, material collection, and cooperative labor. Assembling 149 mammoth bones, some weighing hundreds of kilograms, into interlocking dome structures was not the work of a single individual or a single afternoon. It was communal construction on a scale that implies social organization, shared architectural knowledge, and a commitment to place. These were not humans passing through. These were humans who built something and stayed. Yet the mammoth bone huts were not the only shelters being constructed during the Ice Age. The next entry reveals a far more fragile kind of home, one that almost did not survive long enough to be found. Number 8. The brushwood floor. On the southwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee in modern Israel, beneath several meters of lake sediment, lies a site that was submerged for more than 20,000 years. Homo II was a small camp of brush huts occupied approximately 23,000 years ago during the last glacial maximum. The site was discovered in 1989 when drought conditions caused the water level of the Sea of Galilee to drop, briefly exposing the ancient lakeshore. Archaeologist Dani Nadel of the University of Haifa led excavations that revealed the remains of 6 oval brush hut foundations. The huts were small, roughly 3 to 4 meters in diameter, with floors made of compacted grass and branches. The walls had been constructed by bending flexible branches into a dome shape and weaving vegetation through them. Hearths sat outside the huts rather than inside, and the camp was littered with tens of thousands of seeds, fruits, and plant remains, extraordinarily preserved by the anaerobic conditions of the lake sediment. The botanical evidence was staggering. Ehud Weiss of Bar-Ilan University analyzed the plant remains and identified over 140 species of seeds, fruits, and cereals. Among them were wild wheat and barley, gathered and processed 10,000 years before the advent of agriculture. The residents of Homo II were grinding grain on stone surfaces. They were not farming, but they were doing something that looked, in hindsight, like a rehearsal for farming. The huts themselves were too fragile to survive in open-air conditions. The only reason they exist at all is that the site was rapidly flooded by rising lake levels shortly after abandonment, sealing the organic remains in waterlogged sediment that prevented decomposition. This raises a question that haunts shelter archaeology. How many thousands of brushwood huts, hide tents, and woven shelters were built across the Paleolithic and vanished without a trace, because the materials rotted within a few years of being abandoned? The answer almost certainly is an incomprehensible number. The archaeological record of early shelter construction is not a record of what was built. It is a record of what survived. Stone circles persist. Mammoth bones persist. Post holes in hard sediment persist. Brush and hide and woven reeds do not. The earliest homes were almost certainly made of the most perishable materials imaginable, which means the first house ever built has been gone for so long that no physical evidence of its existence will ever be found. What Homo II demonstrates is that the architecture of perishable materials was already sophisticated 23,000 years ago. The people living there were not experimenting with shelter. They were executing a tradition that had been refined over generations. Where that tradition began is a question the archaeological record cannot answer. The next entry moves forward in time to a moment when the concept of home changed permanently. Number 7. The sunken room. Between approximately 12,500 and 9,500 BCE, a culture emerged in the eastern Mediterranean that would lay the foundations for everything that came after. The Natufians, named after the site of Wadi an-Natuf in the West Bank, where they were first identified by archaeologist Dorothy Garrod in 1928, were among the first people on Earth to build permanent villages. At the site of Ain Malaha, also known as Ainan, in the upper Jordan Valley near Lake Hula, archaeologists uncovered the remains of round and oval houses dating to approximately 12,000 BCE. The structures were semi-subterranean, dug partially into the ground with low stone walls supporting a superstructure of brushwood. The floors were plastered. Central hearths provided heat. Some houses measured up to 6 meters in diameter, large enough for a family group. The Natufians were not farmers. They hunted gazelle. They gathered wild cereals and nuts. They fished in the nearby lake. But unlike every human culture that preceded them, they stayed. They built houses and lived in them year-round, or close to it. They buried their dead beneath the floors of their homes. They decorated their bodies with shell ornaments and bone jewelry. They ground grain on heavy stone querns too large to carry from camp to camp. Ofer Bar Yosef of Harvard University described the Natufian base camps as important novelties in the archaeological record, representing the foundations of the Neolithic village in the Middle East. The roundhouses included post holes, storage features, and evidence of repeated rebuilding across generations, suggesting that families maintained and renewed the same structures over long periods. The shift from mobile foraging to settled village life was not instantaneous. Late Natufian sites show smaller structures and signs of increased mobility, possibly in response to the cold, dry Younger Dryas period, around 10,800 BCE. The Natufian settlement pattern may have oscillated between sedentism and mobility for centuries, before the commitment to permanent villages became irreversible. What makes the Natufian villages truly significant is not their architecture, which was simple, it is what they represent. For the first time in the human story, the house became a fixed point around which a community organized its entire existence. Food was processed there. The dead were interred there. Tools were stored there. Identity itself became anchored to a place. The concept of home, as something more than shelter, began here. And once it began, it never stopped. However, the Natufian villages were small, scattered, and modest. The next entry examines a site that makes them look primitive by comparison, a monumental complex built before permanent homes even existed. Number 6. The Temple Before the House. Göbekli Tepe sits on a limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey, overlooking the Harran Plain. The site dates to approximately 9600 BCE, making it roughly 11,600 years old. It predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years, and the Egyptian pyramids by more than 7,000. And it was built by people who had not yet invented agriculture, pottery, or permanent settlements. The site is dominated by massive T-shaped pillars carved with reliefs of animals, including snakes, foxes, vultures, boars, and lions. Some pillars weigh more than 10 tons. They are arranged in circular enclosures that archaeologists believe served ritual or ceremonial purposes. There is no evidence of permanent habitation at Göbekli Tepe. People came from surrounding regions, gathered, performed rituals, and left. In 2012, Oliver Dietrich of the German Archaeological Institute and colleagues published findings in the journal Antiquity, reporting that 6 barrel-shaped and trough-shaped limestone vessels found at the site contained residues consistent with the fermentation of cereal grains. Some vessels held up to 160 liters of liquid. Chemical analysis identified probable traces of calcium oxalate, a compound produced during the brewing of beer. The implication was striking. Disparate groups of Neolithic hunter-gatherers were traveling to a remote hilltop to participate in communal rituals that involved massive quantities of fermented grain beverages. Dietrich stated that production and consumption of alcoholic beverages was an important factor in feasts, facilitating the cohesion of social groups and in organizing collective work. The genetic evidence adds another layer. Researchers at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences demonstrated that the earliest domestication of einkorn wheat occurred in the vicinity of the Karakadag Mountains, within walking distance of Göbekli Tepe. The grain that feeds the modern world may have first been cultivated not to fill stomachs, but to fill the brewing troughs of a Neolithic temple. Göbekli Tepe presents an inversion of the traditional narrative. The standard model held that agriculture came first, generating surplus food that allowed permanent settlements, which then produced the social complexity required to build monumental structures. Göbekli Tepe suggests the reverse. The desire to gather, to perform rituals, and to feast may have driven the domestication of grain, and eventually, the construction of permanent homes. The temple came before the house. The social impulse came before the economic one. The question of when humans built their first homes may be inseparable from the question of why they needed to gather in the first place. The next entry examines a city so old that its walls predate every other known urban fortification by thousands of years. Number 5. The Walled City. Jericho sits in the Jordan Rift Valley near the northern shore of the Dead Sea, roughly 258 meters below sea level. It is one of the lowest permanently inhabited places on Earth. It may also be the oldest. Archaeological evidence from the site known as Tel es Sultan, the ancient mound beneath and beside the modern city, shows continuous occupation stretching back to approximately 9000 BCE. The earliest settlement, dating to the pre-pottery Neolithic A period, consisted of small, round, semi-subterranean dwellings, similar to those found at Natufian sites. Mud brick walls supported domed roofs. Floors were plastered smooth. The community grew grain and herded animals in the fertile oasis created by the Ain Sultan spring. What distinguishes Jericho from every other early settlement is what surrounded it. By approximately 8000 BCE, the community had constructed a massive stone wall, roughly 3.6 meters tall, surrounding the settlement. Behind the wall stood a stone tower approximately 8.5 meters high, with an internal staircase of 22 steps. The tower is the oldest known monumental stone structure built for a civic or defensive purpose. The wall and tower required thousands of hours of coordinated labor. Kathleen Kenyon, the British archaeologist who excavated the site between 1952 and 1958, interpreted the fortifications as defensive structures, evidence of organized warfare in the earliest Neolithic. However, more recent interpretations by researchers including Ofer Bar Yosef have suggested that the wall may have served primarily as a flood barrier, protecting the settlement from seasonal mud flows that cascade through the nearby wadis. The tower, in this reading, may have functioned as a communal gathering point or a marker of community identity, rather than a military installation. Regardless of its purpose, the wall at Jericho demonstrates that by 10,000 years ago, human communities had crossed a threshold. They were not merely building individual houses, they were building collective infrastructure. Walls, towers, shared defenses, communal labor projects. The house had become part of something larger, a settlement. A place worth protecting. A place worth the enormous expenditure of energy required to surround it with stone. The transition from building a shelter to building a wall around a cluster of shelters is the transition from survival to civilization. And it happened far earlier than most people realize. The next entry examines a transformation in house design so fundamental that it reshaped every building that came after. Number 4. The Rectangle Revolution. For hundreds of thousands of years, every known human-built structure was round. From the stone circle at Olduvai to the mammoth bone domes of Ukraine, to the Natufian houses at Ain Malaha, the circle was the universal shape of shelter. Then, around 9500 BCE, something changed. At the site of Tel Moribet, on the banks of the Euphrates in northern Syria, the Moribetian culture began building rectangular houses. The transition was not gradual. Over a period of a few centuries, the dominant architectural form across the Levant shifted from circular to rectilinear. Chalk blocks were chipped into cigar shapes and bonded with mortar. Rooms were divided into specialized spaces, separate areas for sleeping, cooking, storage, and tool production. Flat mud roofs supported by wooden joists replaced the domed ceilings of round houses. Between the houses, communal open areas contained large fire pits. The architectural historian and theorist have long debated why this transition occurred. Round houses are structurally efficient. They distribute load evenly across the walls and resist wind from all directions. But they are difficult to expand. You cannot easily add a room to a circle. Rectangles, by contrast, can be extended by adding new rooms along a shared wall. They tessellate. They pack efficiently against other rectangles, allowing the creation of dense settlements with minimal wasted space between structures. The rectangle made the city possible. A settlement of round houses is a collection of independent units separated by irregular gaps. A settlement of rectangular houses is a grid, a system, an organism. The shift from circle to rectangle was not just an architectural change, it was a social one. It marked the beginning of spatial hierarchy, the separation of private from public, the allocation of different functions to different rooms. You live in a rectangle? Every apartment, office, hospital, school, warehouse, and prison, built in the past 11,000 years, descends from the decision made at Tel Muribet to straighten the walls. The circle was the shape of shelter. The rectangle was the shape of civilization. But the most extraordinary early settlement was neither fully circular nor conventionally rectangular. The next entry examines a city that had no streets, no doors at ground level, and no clear explanation for how it functioned. Number 3. The city without streets. Catalhoyuk sits on the Konya Plain in central Turkey, a vast Neolithic settlement that flourished from approximately 7500 BCE to 5600 BCE. At its peak, it may have housed between 5,000 and 8,000 people. That is an astonishing population for a settlement 9,000 years old, and the way those people lived defies almost every assumption about how early cities functioned. There were no streets, no alleys, no pathways of any kind at ground level. The mud brick houses were built directly against one another in a dense honeycomb pattern, wall touching wall, with no gaps between structures. Entry into each house was through a hole in the roof, accessed by a wooden ladder. The rooftops functioned as the streets. Daily life, cooking, socializing, the movement of goods, all of it happened above the houses, not between them. Inside each dwelling, the layout was remarkably standardized. A hearth and oven sat against the south wall. Raised platforms along the walls served as sleeping areas. A stone dresser opposite the entrance displayed important objects, and beneath the floors the residents buried their dead. Skulls were sometimes removed from the bodies, plastered to resemble living faces and kept within the house. The living and the dead occupied the same space. The site was first excavated by James Mellard in the early 1960s. His work revealed the extraordinary density and artistic richness of the settlement, but was cut short by controversy. Ian Hodder of Stanford University resumed excavations in 1993 and has directed the project for over 3 decades. Hodder's team has documented 18 successive layers of construction, each built upon the rubble of the one before, gradually raising the mound to a height of over 20 meters. One of the most striking findings was the absence of hierarchical structures. All houses at Catalhoyuk are approximately the same size. None contain significantly more storage, larger hearths, or better tools than any other. There are no palaces, no temples, no buildings that suggest centralized authority. Burial analysis shows no significant differences in diet or workload between men and women. The settlement appears to have been, in the language of modern archaeology, egalitarian. Why no streets? One theory suggests that the layout provided defense. An attacker approaching the settlement would face a solid wall of mud brick on all sides, with no doors to breach. The only way in was from the roof, and from the roof the defenders had the advantage. Another theory points to the seasonal flooding of the Karsamba River. Ground-level pathways would have become muddy and impassable during wet periods. Rooftop movement avoided the problem entirely. Whatever the reason, Catalhoyuk represents a model of urban life radically different from anything that followed. It was a city without rulers, without streets, without the spatial hierarchy that defines every modern settlement. And it lasted for nearly 2,000 years. Could something like that work today? The answer is almost certainly no. But the fact that it worked then raises questions about assumptions we make about how cities must be organized. The next entry examines a village so perfectly preserved that you can still see the furniture inside the houses, 5,000 years after the last resident left. Number 2. The Storm Village. In the winter of 1850, a ferocious storm battered the west coast of Orkney, a cluster of islands off the northern tip of Scotland. Wind stripped the grass and sand from a coastal mound known locally as Scarabra, near the Bay of Scale. When the storm subsided, local landowner William Watt walked the shoreline and found stone walls emerging from the dunes. He had no idea what he was looking at. Neither did anyone else. Watt began informal excavations, uncovering 4 structures. The site was then largely abandoned until another storm in 1925 damaged the exposed remains. Between 1928 and 1930, archaeologist V. Gordon Child of the University of Edinburgh conducted a full excavation. What emerged was astonishing. 8 interconnected stone houses, linked by covered passageways, with their furniture still standing inside. Stone beds flanked the walls. Stone dressers faced the doorways. Central hearths sat cold but intact. Stone-lined storage tanks, possibly for keeping shellfish alive, were set into the floors. Drainage channels ran beneath the structures. Child initially believed the settlement dated to the Iron Age, approximately 500 BCE. He was wrong by more than 500 years. Radiocarbon dating conducted during later excavations by David Clark in the 1970s established that Skara Brae had been occupied from roughly 3,100 to 2,500 BCE. The village was 5,000 years old, older than the Great Pyramid of Giza, older than Stonehenge. The extraordinary preservation was a consequence of two factors. First, the residents built everything from stone, because there was almost no timber on the windswept Orkney Islands. Wood rots. Stone does not. Second, when the village was abandoned around 2500 BCE, shifting sands buried it completely, creating an accidental time capsule that sealed the interiors from erosion, weather, and human disturbance for 3.5 millennia. Skara Brae is not the oldest settlement in the world. It is not even the oldest in Orkney. Nap of Howard, on the island of Papa Westray, dates to approximately 3700 BCE, several centuries earlier. But Skara Brae is the most complete Neolithic village ever found in Western Europe. You can walk through it and see not just walls and foundations, but the actual rooms where people slept, cooked, and stored their possessions. You can see where they placed objects on their stone dressers. You can see where they sat beside their hearths. The people of Skara Brae farmed cattle, sheep, and barley. They gathered shellfish along the shore. They made pottery, carved stone beads, and crafted mysterious carved stone balls whose purpose has never been determined. They wore bone pendants and used tools made from the volcanic rock of the nearby island of Hoy, evidence that they traded with communities beyond their immediate settlement. Why they left remains unknown. One theory suggests a catastrophic storm, similar to the one that would reveal the village thousands of years later. Another points to a gradual worsening of Orkney's climate that made farming increasingly difficult. Whatever the cause, they appear to have departed suddenly. Objects were left behind. The village was not dismantled. They simply walked away. The sand came next. And there the village waited, for 35 centuries, until another storm came along and stripped the covering away, returning to the light a world that had been perfectly preserved in darkness. Could a settlement like Skara Brae survive if it were discovered today for the first time? In one sense, it already has. Rising sea levels driven by climate change are eroding the coastline around the Bay of Scale, and the protective seawall built in the 1920s is aging. The same forces of nature that revealed Skara Brae may eventually consume it. The final entry in this video does not describe a single discovery. It describes the question that all 15 entries have been circling. Number 1. The oldest question. When did humans build their first home? The answer depends entirely on what you mean by home. If home is any modification of the environment for the purpose of shelter, then the answer stretches back more than 1 million years to a fire burning 30 meters inside a South African cave. If home is a deliberate built structure, then the answer may be 176,000 years old, deep inside Bruniquel Cave, where Neanderthals arranged stalagmites into geometric rings in total darkness. If home requires the concept of a fixed dwelling, a place you return to and maintain, then the mammoth bone huts of Ukraine, built 18,000 years ago and occupied for 429 years, qualify. If home requires a village, a cluster of structures occupied by a community, then the Natufian roundhouses at Ain Malaha, built around 12,000 BCE by people who had not yet learned to farm, are the earliest known examples. But archaeologist Ian Tattersall of the American Museum of Natural History has argued that the concept of home, as modern humans understand it, requires something more than physical construction. It requires symbolic thought, the ability to invest a space with meaning beyond its functional purpose. The ability to say not just this is where I sleep, but this is where I belong. That capacity, the capacity for symbolic reasoning, appears to have emerged in Homo sapiens no earlier than approximately 100,000 years ago. The Natufians who built the first villages could experience home in a way that the Homo heidelbergensis who built the huts at Terra Amata almost certainly could not. Not because the Natufian structures were more advanced, but because the Natufian mind was. The complex, layered, emotionally resonant idea of home that you carry in your head right now is an invention of your species alone. Every entry in this video describes a step in a journey that spans millions of years, from an orangutan testing the flexibility of a branch before weaving it into a nest, to a Neolithic family in Orkney arranging carved stone balls on a dresser in a house that still stands 5 millennia later. The impulse to shape space, to enclose warmth, to create an inside that is different from the outside, is older than our species. But the meaning we attach to that impulse, The sense of identity, belonging, memory, and loss that the word home carries is ours. And here is the unsettling part. For 99% of the time that humans have existed, the idea of a permanent home did not exist. We wandered. We sheltered in caves and beneath rock overhangs. We built temporary structures from branches and hides and bones, used them for a season or a generation, and moved on. The concept of a fixed address, a house that belongs to you, that you own, that defines your place in a community, is an invention of the last 12,000 years. A blink. A fraction of the time our species has walked the earth. The oldest homes were not investments. They were not assets. They were not expressions of wealth or status. They were solutions to a problem that has never changed. The world outside is cold. The wind is blowing. The darkness is approaching. And somewhere in the architecture of your brain, a circuit that was wired millions of years ago in the canopy of an African forest is telling you the same thing it told the first primate, whoever bent a branch to make a platform above the ground. Find a place. Shape it. Stay. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on the screen now.